Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Remember, there's a disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to hear. I think we can safely say that the world of fintech is evolving rapidly, and this is exemplified by the Cambrian explosion of virtual currencies and tokens. Now, we at the CFTC work diligently to stay on top of this new financial ecosystem, as do many other agencies like the SEC, the Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve, as well as international groups like the Bank of England and the FCA. And I encourage all of our listeners to track down their research and the reports that come from these groups on virtual currencies and tokens, as they're really fantastic repositories of knowledge that their teams have created, and often with the assistance of private sector companies actually involved with trading or issuing or managing risk in this space. And today, we're fortunate to have on someone from one of those offices producing this type of information. So John Castiglione is the Senior Enforcement Counsel in the New York Attorney General's Investor Protection Bureau. Now, his office recently produced a must-read for anyone who is involved in the virtual currency or token markets. The name of the research is the Virtual Markets Integrity Initiative report, which you can just search and download from the New York State Attorney General's office website, or just put it in your search engine, the name of that, Virtual Markets Integrity Initiative report, and it'll pop right up. John, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Thank you so much, Andy. Happy to be here.
Great. Hey, before we get to the report, let's talk about your office and its mission at the New York State Attorney General's office. What is its role there?
Sure. So I am Senior Enforcement Counsel in the Investor Protection Bureau, and our bureau is charged with enforcing the Martin Act, which is the New York State Anti-Securities and Commodities Fraud Statute. Now, the Martin Act was passed in 1921, so it predates the federal securities laws and is actually one of the oldest blue sky, so-called blue sky laws in the country. So that's what we do. We are a civil securities and commodities fraud enforcement bureau. Separate in our office, we do have a criminal enforcement and financial crimes division, which, as its name suggests, is responsible for criminal violations of the Martin Act and other laws. But our bureau deals in civil frauds.
Okay.
And so that's what we do here.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So, and I know kind of somewhat connected to what we're going to talk about today, that the New York State Department of Financial Services has a BIT license. And I know that that's not your office, but I was just wondering if you could maybe help level set our audience a little bit about what that BIT license is.
Absolutely. So taking one step back, the Department of Financial Services was created in 2011 by transferring the functions of the New York State Banking Department and the New York State Insurance Department into one new department. And that's important, I think, to understand because the BIT license really grows out of the Department of Financial Services responsibilities with respect to banking functions. And so the BIT license, they're not that long. I would encourage anyone who's interested to go, Google BIT license and read them. But really, what the BIT license does is regulate virtual currency business activity that has a connection to the state of New York. And so, in essence, what the BIT license requires is that those who are conducting any virtual currency business activity in the state of New York to obtain a license, and that unlicensed business activity is prohibited.
Well,
so maybe, go ahead. Go ahead. So one way to think about it maybe that would be helpful would be the Department of Financial Services really acts as a rule setter or a regulator with respect to virtual currency business activity in the state of New York, whereas the Office of the Attorney General, where I am, and in my bureau, is a civil law enforcement agency. So sort of two sides to the coin there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So somebody makes the rules and you enforce them, basically.
Yeah, a little more complicated than that, but you could say that.
Right. Sorry. I don't mean it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, both your office and DFS has been really, you guys have been at the forefront of virtual currencies, and the BIT license came into effect, ladies and gentlemen, in 2015. And that, like in fintech years, that's like dog years. So that's like 21 years for the rest of us. And because fintech is moving so quickly, I know, at our agency, we spend a lot of time looking at this, not too much time. We've got a lot of things to do, but it's an important new development that we're all learning about and really trying to understand better. But this is your office's first foray into this space. So let's jump over into the Virtual Markets Report and talk a little bit about the process by which the report was created. What was the genesis or spark for this initiative on virtual currency trading platforms?
I think there's really 3 or maybe 4 main drivers of why the Office of the Attorney General got involved in the virtual currency space and launched the Virtual Currency Integrity Initiative, a Virtual Markets Integrity Initiative, excuse me. So the first is, the Office of the Attorney General is really in some sense, a public-facing agency. We are often the first place folks call when they have problems that are connected to what we do here. So in the Investor Protection Bureau, we will get calls about folks who have problems with their brokers, sometimes their bank. We'll get calls for all sorts of things. And, last year and even before that, we started really hearing more and more about concerns or problems with virtual currency trading platforms. Some of them were beyond what we do as an office. I called customer service and I was put on hold and no one ever picked up and so forth and so on. But other than really focus in on some problems people were having with these platforms that really implicated, our investor protection remit. So that's sort of one perhaps the main driver. The other one was, look, we needed to inform ourselves. We are charged with enforcing the Martin Act, which is a securities and commodities fraud statute. And as everyone listening to this, I'm sure, knows, there's been a lot of talk about whether virtual currencies are securities, are more like commodities, can be both, can be neither. And so as part of our obligation to enforce the Martin Act, we needed to get smarter on virtual currencies. And related to that point, we do have securities and commodities fraud enforcement authority. We also have a number of other bureaus within the Office of the Attorney General that are implicated by virtual currency and specifically virtual currency trading platforms. Among them would be our Consumer Frauds Bureau, which is charged with enforcing something called Executive Law Section 6312, which is essentially a repeated and persistent business fraud statute that applies to all sorts of business conduct that has a connection to the state of New York. We also here at the office have a Bureau of Internet and Technology, which focuses, as its name would suggest, on tech issues and things like that. Right. So it all implicated that. And really, our office, because of our broad statutory authority, sat at the nexus, if you will, of several of the issues that are being discussed at the federal level with respect to authority over virtual currencies. And so we found ourselves in a place where it made sense for us to really be involved. And I'll mention just one other thing. Going back to, I think, probably early 2014, the Investor Protection Bureau has been involved heavily in electronic trading in the equities space. And we've had a number of investigations, many of which have had public resolutions regarding the equity market structure, and more specifically, some of the conflicts that have arisen in that structure that have impacted retail investors. And so to the extent a lot of what we have learned in those cases, which deal with sort of very complex cutting-edge technology and trading market structure, that was, in some sense, directly applicable to the virtual currency trading platform space. And so to the extent our efforts in virtual currency are an extension of that, it just made sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of, that was very helpful. Thank you. I think it makes a lot of sense because you start, it's funny how you start in one space, right? In electronic trading, really, I mean, this all gets generated because of the digitization of finance, right? And so as finance has become technology or fintech, this is where all the regulators and people looking at these markets sit. But I think it's interesting, the evolution, I guess, of the New York State Attorney General's office and how you were pulled into this because of electronic trading. And then that just makes sense that if you're getting a lot of complaints or people talking about problems that are happening in the virtual currency space, that you would start to look at it. That makes a lot of sense. So
Right. And that's really the history of our office going back, over 90 years now, is that as the markets evolve, we need to keep up with it. Our statute gives us the authority to police the markets, but if we are going to be effective, we really need to understand and be involved with, emerging technologies nowadays. And so, I saw our efforts in the virtual currency space as simply part of our obligation to protect New Yorkers.
Well, and I think what's great too, at your agency like mine, we depend on the public to some extent to say, hey, this is what we're seeing. Is this right or is this wrong? And then it really helps because more eyes reporting on more things that look unusual is really critical for what we do.
Sure. And, I think that goes both ways insofar as we hear things from the public, hey, what's going on? But we also have an obligation, I think, to understand from the perspective of those in the industry what's really going on.
Oh, sure. Sure.
I would say, especially in this space where there's a lot of stuff out there about what's going on or what might be going on, a lot of non-transparency, if you will. I think to the extent my office and other offices are going to be involved in law enforcement in this space, we have an obligation to hear it from those who are actually participating in the industry. And I can tell you that some things that I thought going into this process were not true. Because, I'd read something on the internet and it sounded really bad, but it turns out that there's actually a good explanation for it. And the reverse. Some things I thought were probably fine turned out to, raise some levels of concern. So that education process, I think, was really helpful for me personally, and I know others in our office.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I have a lot of fun with personally is to look and stay in contact with the private sector. Like, go out and see people, go meet them at their offices, talk to them, ask them for help, because for us, we really need information flow, and that's what we seek out. That's part of my role at the agency, which is really fun, which is why, of course, I'm talking to you, and that's so great to talk about your report. And I want to get back to your report, so let's describe the process, or could you describe the process of how your team went about getting the information?
Sure. And so building off, I think, what we talked about at this information gathering function, we thought it made sense to reach out not with compulsory process like subpoenas in the first instance, but rather we sent letters to 13 of some of the biggest trading platforms around the world and here in New York, as well as all of those trading platforms that were licensed by DFS for operations in New York. We sent them a letter, attached a bunch of questions on all sorts of topics, and that's how we thought it was the best way to start our reach out. As if you've read the report, you'll see 9 platforms responded and participated in the initiative. Several did not, at least a couple very publicly did not. And then along the way, one other platform came online. It hadn't been open for business when we started, but it came on over the summer, and so they participated as well. So by the end, we were interacting with 10 trading platforms around the country and around the world, giving us the information that we needed to compile the report.
That makes sense. Let me just say, ladies and gentlemen, you can just Google this and download it. It's a PDF. It's Virtual Markets Integrity Initiative Report. If you put that title in there and type in OAG and then hit, whatever search engine you use, not just Google, but you can search for it, it'll pop right up. Was there? I guess my question is: so 9 out of 13. Was there any reason why, they wouldn't respond, or were some of them not in New York, or I know this is a little bit of some of the issue that was going on with the information gathering, but it seems like the opportunity to participate in something like that, I'm just not sure why most people wouldn't have responded.
That's what we thought, and that's the attitude we took. As we say in the report, some platforms responded that they didn't do business in New York and therefore didn't need to or didn't want to respond. We found through the course of our initiative that some platforms that said they weren't operating in New York may in fact have been, and on that basis, we made a referral to DFS. But right, our view is that any of these platforms around the world, at least the legitimate ones, should want to engage in this kind of process with our office or any other law enforcement agency around the world, because, to the extent their practices and policies and procedures are fair to users, they should want that known. And so, by and large, that's the reaction that we got from the trading platforms that we were dealing with, is that it's good to be involved in an initiative like this to clear up misconceptions and to make it so that those retail customers, as it were, will understand the trading environment in which they're participating.
So often what we do, and it cracks me up, I have to take a step back and go, before I joined the agency, which was just like, a short period of time ago, I used to look at regulators as kind of, askance, right? Or even attorney general's offices that were looking into this stuff. But the more I stay at this agency and the more I learn from people, especially about virtual currencies, is that it really comes down to trust. And if you don't have trust, like if you're not transparent about what you're doing, you lose that trust. And therefore you would lose the ability for people to feel like they can trust and that understand what's going on at a platform so that they would feel comfortable trading on that platform. So to your point, I think it would be an advantage for any of those firms to be clear about what they're doing so everybody is level set on how things work.
Look, and I get it. I know that there is a strain, call it that, in the virtual currency environment that is somewhat anti-establishment or what have you. And that's fine. It's not really a concern of ours either way. I think what our concern is that to the extent that there are everyday individuals out there using these platforms, that they deserve to know how they function. And some platforms that we interacted with at the beginning of this process had really good disclosures. And a lot of what we did was compiling what was already public about their operations. Others didn't. And to the extent New York investors or anybody else are on those platforms, they deserve to know the rules of the road. And so that's how we saw it. All
right. So I'm sorry to digress on some of these things, but it gets me pumped up about this work. I've read this report. I've told people about it because I think it's important for those reasons that you delineated, but maybe you could delineate it a little bit more. There are 5 sections to this report. Could you just briefly describe what they are?
Absolutely. And I'll say at the outset that, part of what we wanted to do with the report was to make it approachable for the everyday individual, right? There's a lot out there.
Because I'm not that smart and it was it was easy to read. So I just want to...
Me neither.
It was very readable. It's very readable.
Yeah. There's a lot out there from a lot of government agencies and organizations around the world that will really dig in to some technical stuff about the cryptocurrency space, and that's fine and good. We took a little bit of a different approach, and so that's why, our very first section in the report, we talked about jurisdiction, acceptance of currencies, fiat and virtual, and the fees. So that really discussed basic information about how the customer would sign up with trading platforms, access controls in place, meaning, what do you need to submit if you want to join a trading platform, whether it's name, address, email, driver's license, so forth and so on. We walk through which platforms accept fiat currency. Not all do, and I'm not sure that everyone out there necessarily knows that. And then we also talked a little bit about fees. Part of being a state level law enforcement agency or regulator is, fees are really important. It's basic, it's simple, it's maybe not that sexy, but oftentimes that can have an outsized influence on performance. So we thought it was important for folks to get, like you said, a level set as to how some of these platforms operate at a basic level. We then walk through what we saw as important trading policies and really market fairness issues. how does this platform function as a trading venue? And so we had a discussion of order types. And if you see the online version of the report, there's like this cool little float over box where you can check out what an order type means. Well, there's a lot of options, and it's not immediately obvious what a particular order type does. So we have a discussion of that. We talk about the availability, of margin trading, which not all platforms have. We talk about policies on automated trading or algorithmic trading and measures taken by the platforms, if any, to address market manipulation and other abusive trading practices. From there, the report got into issues of conflicts of interest, and we addressed some of the potential conflicts that will arise, or we've seen arise, between the interests of the trading platforms themselves, the trading platforms' employees, and their customers. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that on this podcast later. Mm-hmm. From there, we walk through some of the high-level issues on security and protection of customer funds, and that included a discussion of insurance, if any, held by the platforms over their virtual assets, audits, again, if any, being conducted by the platform operators over their business or the funds in their control, and some of the other issues that go along with safeguarding customer assets. And in the final section, we talk about access to funds and access to the trading platform, specifically with respect to trading suspensions, outages, things like that, and how, whether and how customers were being apprised of trading outages. That was, getting back to what we talked to before, a lot of what we heard from the public was that these trading platforms, some of which are essentially just websites, would go down without explanation. Traders weren't able to access their accounts or withdraw their money. So we presented some of our findings with respect to those issues. And then at the end, we really just presented some questions that users should ask their platforms, and suggested to the public that if platforms don't have good answers to those questions, that you really need to be thinking about whether you should be using them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And note, ladies and gentlemen, not once did John say exchange, because that's not what these things are. They're platforms, right?
Right, and that's really, if there's a main thrust of our report, where there are several, but one of them is that, look, when you're transacting on these platforms, you may think that you're transacting on an exchange as one might understand that concept in the equity space. You are not. Among other things, access to an exchange in the United States requires the use of a broker. And that person is supposed to be a professional with experience and knowledge that can navigate some of these issues. You don't have that here with virtual currency trading platforms. So it's all the more important that users understand how these platforms operate and understand the risks that they are taking on by participating.
Well, I guess it's the big question that I've left here. Actually, I got a few more, but what did you learn from this, or what were the key findings of the report? And did anything surprise you? I know what surprised me. I mean, there was a couple of times I was reading this, I was like, wait a minute, they're doing that? What? So
Right. I guess what was most surprising to me, and the main takeaway from our report, was that trading platforms, many of them, most of them, maybe even all of them, are in multiple business lines that would be separate in the equities or commodities space, or just can't really exist in the equities or commodities space. And I'll give you an example of that. Trading platforms, some of them, they operate not only as venues of exchange, but they also operate as something akin to a broker-dealer as well. And so those functions would be separate in the equity space. The typical situation is you'd go hire a broker in whatever form, and that broker would access the markets for you, a separate entity. So you'd hire your broker, that broker would access, say, the New York Stock Exchange to trade stocks. Well, those functions could be wrapped up into one in the virtual currency space.
And the reason why we do that in the equity markets is because...
I mean, there are a number of reasons for it, but it is protective of, in some sense, of the investor, right? There are two different incentives, at least two different incentives facing exchanges and brokers. Brokers have a duty to their clients. Exchanges are businesses in and of themselves, right? One of the other conflicts that we found is that some platform operators are like issuers. They have interests in virtual currency themselves. that doesn't really exist in the same way in the equity space, right? The owners of the New York Stock Exchange aren't major holders of, say, Apple stock. You know, they may have some in their personal possession, but they don't have a market-controlled interest in that. It's not possible for them to face the kind of conflict of interest that it is in the virtual currency space, insofar as a trading platform operator might have a major stake in a coin being traded on its venue. The same is true insofar as trading venue employees can trade directly on their own platforms or on other platforms in the same virtual currencies that their ownership might hold in large amounts, or they themselves might hold in large amounts and be responsible for when it comes to the workings of the platform. So there are a number of these conflicts that, under the best of circumstances, I think it's safe to say, require intense attention to detail and management by these platforms. And what we found is there is not sufficient, in a number of respects, not sufficient attention to how these conflicts are to be managed.
Yeah, I think there's a wide range of things that it kind of reminds me to some extent of where foreign exchange was back in the 80s when I was trading currencies. And there weren't as many rules as they are now, and rightfully so. There should have been more rules back then too. But I think what's interesting is just myself reading these, because I understood and had been looking at these platforms previously, but I didn't, like everybody else, I think I made assumptions about, the rules that they were operating under. And as you said, some of those are just not there, and there's potential. It's not like it's happening. I mean, wouldn't know until you dove into it a little bit more, but certainly when there's potential for conflicts of interest, that raises a red flag.
Absolutely, and I think it's something that folks should be aware of, and if they aren't, hopefully they read our report and become aware of it. But it's also something I think that the industry can and should take a critical look at in terms of their own operations. What guidelines or guardrails or whatever you want to call it are in place to ensure that a company that is doing 2 or 3 or 4 different things that have the potential to conflict, what are they doing to ensure that the traders on their venue are being treated fairly and are being apprised of what potential conflicts exist, so that folks can make their own decisions about where to transact?
Yeah, that makes sense. And getting back to trust, the more these platforms actually mimic the equity trading structure, the better off they're going to be. It's a business advantage to me that you would be able to engender trust. Again, this is my opinion, not that of the CFTC, but it just seems to make sense there. And one of the things that surprised me, and I'm just kind of re-looking at your key findings, was the third one that you talked about. Protections for customer funds are often limited or illusory. I thought that was like, what? Maybe you could break that down for the audience just a little bit.
Sure. Well, let's take one example maybe, and that would be insurance. As we say in the report, if you want to open a business, you have to have insurance. If you want to open an ice cream stand in your hometown, you're going to have to be insured as a business owner. And that includes, among other things, insurance for the people who walk into your store. And if they slip and fall, you have insurance, right? And you need that on any number of fronts, some of which I can imagine, some of which I can't because I'm not a business owner. Okay. Well, what do the trading platforms have with respect to insurance over their operations? And that includes, among other things, insurance over the virtual and fiat currency in their possession. For a long time, banks have operated in the United States holding people's money, right? Not so with virtual currency. This is a relatively new field. And so what does it mean to hold virtual currency, and how do you get it insured? It's no secret that a number of platforms around the world have been the subject of hacks and had funds stolen, and there's very little, I think, one can do once the money's out the door. It's very hard to recover. So at the very least, is this business insuring the assets in its possession? And we found a lot of different answers. Some platforms claim to have insurance. Some platforms claim to work with insurers to write policies. Other platforms claim that, in their view, there was no adequate insurance policy currently on the market to cover the risks faced by a virtual currency trading platform. So that in particular was the type of issue that folks might not be thinking of when they go to transact on these venues, but it's important to understand. Same with audits. Most businesses of any size are audited periodically, and that includes a review not just of their finances, although that's obviously very important, but of their operations in and of themselves. The same is not true for virtual currency trading platforms. We had a number of conversations, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of the platforms we talked to, including most prominently those that are in fact BIT licensed, are trying to get to a place where they can have third-party auditors or reviewers or whatever you want to call them come in, look at their operations, and say with some degree of confidence they're doing things right, or at least as right as we can understand them today. But that's, I think, still an open question. And so we urged folks to talk to their platform operators, ask them the question, what are you audited? If you are, how's it being done? And what else can be done to ensure that the processes that you're undergoing as a business internally are reasonable?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just want to be fair here. I mean, it's a nascent industry. And so when you're talking about a financial technology that's relatively brand new, 8 years or 10 years, there's so many things that have to be built up around that ecosystem, custody, insurance, you just go down the list. It doesn't mean to say that that's not being addressed, that the people are trying to get to that. It just means that there's a lot of work that needs to get done to get it to be at the same level as what we already have in the regulated exchanges and the regulated structures of our financial markets.
That's true, Andy, but I guess I'll push back a little bit. These platforms hold on to people's money. They are saying, come in, give me your money and trade. And people can have a lot tied into this, whether that's a smart thing or not. That is the case. And so to the extent you're going to stand up as a business and say, give me lots of money or give me control over your virtual currency, I think you should be expected to behave and have processes appropriate to that responsibility. I will agree with you, though, that there are trading platform operators that are working as fast as they can to make sure that they're behaving in a responsible way. And so, certainly when we see that, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. And I urge everybody to read the conclusions, or at least the questions, which I love the way that you guys listed all these questions that people should be asking these platforms. So, all right, before I let you go, what do you see as the Investor Protection Bureau's biggest challenge in the next year?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're taping this on Monday, November 5th, so tomorrow is Election Day. So we will have a new Attorney General here in the next, couple of hours. And so, the priorities of that individual as always, will drive our priorities as an Investor Protection Bureau over the next several years. But I think really our mandate doesn't change. We still have to enforce the Martin Act. It's our obligation. And that requires us to be looking at among other things, how trading platforms operate with respect to their trade in securities or commodities. So that won't change. The other thing that won't change is this space. The sector will continue to evolve. As you said at the outset, things move quickly, and I think it's our obligation to try to keep up with that as best we can. And so we're going to continue to do that. And so I suspect if we had this conversation in a year from now, we would be talking about some different things because there will be new innovations and new business models. But look, at the end of the day, fraud is fraud. There are still retail investors that need to be protected. And so whatever way we need to do that, we're trying to think of how we can do that the best way possible. So that's what we're going to do.
All right. Senior Enforcement Counselor in the New York Attorney General's Investor Protection Bureau, John Castiglione. Thanks for coming on the show today. Thank you so much. Happy to do it. That's a wrap for this week. Remember, you can get access to all the shows we do here by either going to our website at cftc.gov or by getting out your phone, clicking on the podcast app, and typing in CFTC Talks. Click subscribe if you want to get them every week. I'm Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Thanks for listening. This has been CFTC Talks. But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guest. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.